Welcome back. We are going to continue our exploration of Islam, and in this video focus more on the political or state building side. So we'll focus more on Islam as an expanding empire. So the big questions we need to be able to answer are: first, what caused Islam to split shortly after Muhammad's death? Second, how did Muslims unify and consolidate their empire? And then third, what caused the Islamic Caliphates of the Islamic Empire to eventually collapse? What caused Islam to split shortly after Muhammad's death? In the last video, we described how Muhammad was able to unify the various warring Bedouin tribes or clans on the Arabian Peninsula, but ultimately upon his death there was an issue of succession about who should succeed Muhammad as both the political and spiritual leader of this growing Muslim community. Some Muslims wanted Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's close friend. He was also an experienced military leader, and therefore, in many people's eyes, he was the person who was most qualified for this title, while others wanted and believed that the title of leader needed to stay within the bloodlines, within the family. And at one point, Muhammad had given a speech where he had referenced that his cousin Ali was a possible candidate for succession, and therefore some viewed him as the rightful successor. So there is this split, and the sect of Muslims that wanted Abu Bakr to become the leader, who believed that Abu Bakr was the rightful leader, became the Sunni Muslims. They represent the majority of Muslims today. About 90% of all Muslims are Sunni Muslims. But then there's this minority of Shia who were supporters of Ali, who believed that the title of successor should remain within the family. So this is the origins of the split. It gets very, very, very complicated. We've just oversimplified things for purposes of time. But ultimately, this is what leads to this really critical split between Sunni Muslims, who represent today the majority, and I always remember that because the sun is large and big, and then the Shia Muslims, who represent the minority. Now, why is this important today? Well, we can see the majority of Muslims across the world are Sunni Muslims. That's the light green color. But you can see strong pockets of Shia Muslims, especially here in Iran, and we'll talk about why that is later. You can also see a pocket of Shia Muslims here in Iraq, and also in Syria and in Afghanistan. Now, when we think about countries that are unstable today, these are four countries that oftentimes are at the top of that list: Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, and partly because of the internal conflict that arises as a result of the sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Now you ask yourself, well, how did we end up with these boundaries? Why weren't boundaries drawn more consistent with the various sects of Islam to avoid that sectarian conflict? And that question will be answered later on in the course when we talk about the boundaries of the Middle East, which were drawn post-World War I by the British and the French. Now, Abu Bakr was ultimately chosen to be the first caliph. A caliph is a ruler of the Islamic Empire. It's both a political and religious figure in the same way that Muhammad assumed that role, and the caliph leads the caliphate. So when describing Islamic states, we'll be referring to them as caliphates and not empires, although essentially they are the same. So how did Muslims unify and consolidate their empire? Really, the history of the Islamic Empire can be divided up into two major dynasties, or also what's referred to as caliphates. There's the Umayyad from 661 to 750 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate, and then the Abbasid Caliphate from 750 to 1258 CE. So here's a map again showing the Islamic Empire first in dark red, the areas that were under the conquest of Muhammad, and then these red areas were regions that were conquered by the four subsequent caliphs to Muhammad, oftentimes referred to as the rightly guided caliphs. Following the rule of Ali, we have the power transitioning back to the Sunni Muslims under the Umayyad Caliphate, and you can see the map showing the expansiveness of the Umayyad Caliphate. So it expands all the way from Spain here in Western Europe all the way across North Africa, all the territories in the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, and then all the way over here into Persia, up to the Caspian and Black Seas. So this massive, large empire, incredibly diverse, lots of different linguistic traditions, although as a result of the spread of Islam, we also see the spread of the language of Arabic, also many different religious traditions in this region, including the Holy Land here. Important, we see the conquest of this region, including the city of Jerusalem, which was taken over by Muslims around 700 CE. The capital of the Umayyad Caliphate was Damascus, which is in modern-day Syria. So the Umayyads were very tolerant of non-Muslims in the empire. This would have included Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians. When it came to Jews and Christians, they referred to them as people of the book, right? Because they're following in this tradition of monotheism in the same way that Judaism and Christianity did. Now, this should sound familiar. This policy of tolerance towards non-believers was not only something that was professed by Muhammad, but also was a legacy of the earlier Persian empires. Remember the Cyrus the Great and the tolerance that he displayed, despite having the official state religion of Zoroastrianism, the tolerance that he showed and the way in which that was able to bring together and unify people of various traditions. The Islamic Caliphate was not an empire where conversion was forced upon people, but eventually many did convert, and one of the reasons they did convert was because of this. There was a required tax that had to be paid by any non-believer. They encouraged conversion by requiring non-Muslims to pay a high tax. This tax is called the jizya. So the jizya tax. And as a result, many non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, people who worship polytheism, Zoroastrianism, ended up converting to Islam. So eventually the Umayyad dynasty would be replaced by the Abbasid dynasty. So the Abbasid overthrew the Umayyads in 750 CE, and you can see some contraction of the empire under the Abbasids as various other Islamic states formed in North Africa and in Spain. The Abbasids moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad. The Abbasid dynasty is considered the golden age of Islamic culture. In Baghdad, there was a research and library center known as the House of Wisdom that brought scholars from all across the empire, from parts of the Middle East, from Persia, from Spain, and they brought together all of these ideas from all of these diverse regions that formulated part of the Islamic State. And they translated these classical age texts, which included Greek text like Aristotle, into Arabic, and these scholars developed a number of innovations. So here we can see one of the texts that was produced during this period by Al-Khwarizmi, and you can see maybe one of the words that looks familiar in here. This is algebra, so the book on calculation by completion and balancing. So it was these Islamic scholars that really developed the mathematics of algebra, and that's where that word algebra comes from. It is an Arabic word. They also utilized a number system that was first developed by the Indians in the Gupta Empire. We talked about that before. And so they ultimately spread this number system. As a result, it became more commonly used. And so this is referred to today as the Arabic Hindu numerals, which is the basis for the number system that we use today. They also made advancements in medicine. So here you can see a diagram of an eye, and so they were very interested in anatomical research. They made advancements in medicine and medical technologies. So one of the big unifying features of the Islamic Caliphate and ultimately the spread of Islam was the way in which a common shared cultural characteristic allowed people to come together and trade. So historians sometimes refer to this as Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, this one united Islamic community, which basically created a zone of trade and communication across Afro-Eurasia. As a result of increased trade, we saw the increased size and scope of trading cities. So the trade led to a growth of cities. One that you need to be aware of is Cordoba, which is in Spain. Whenever you have a unified trade zone like this, we also see the spread of crops. And so some crops to be aware of that spread across Dar al-Islam in the Islamic world were sugarcane, starting in Southeast Asia and eventually spreading through India and eventually across the Middle East, and then down into North Africa and out into Europe. So crops like sugar and cotton are going to spread across Dar al-Islam during this period. Some other economic innovations that were produced in the Islamic world were credit, right? So the system that we currently use of credit made trade easier. There was a system of banks which allowed for merchants to be able to move from one city or trading area to the next without having to lug all these very heavy metal coins around. And so a system of banking was also developed in the Islamic world. And all of these innovations would eventually spread and make their way to places like Europe and be utilized by Europeans later on in world history. When various cultural traditions spread out, they oftentimes form these diasporic communities. So for example, we see here the Great Mosque in Xi'an, China, and you can see the effect of Muslim merchants and the formation of these diasporic communities is syncretism, right? The spreading of cultural traditions. Now, when these Muslims went to China, obviously they didn't impose Islam on China, but over time they gradually exposed more and more people to their cultural traditions and practices, and ultimately blending those with the existing local flavor and customs. Now, one of the great Islamic travelers during this period is Ibn Battuta. He was originally from Morocco, and he set out on a journey to go on the Hajj. So he was going on his pilgrimage from Morocco here to Mecca, and so he goes to Arabia, India, China, Mali, and so he gets a glimpse of the way in which Islam is practiced in these various regions, and he has a very particular idea about how Islam should be practiced, and he finds, as we'll read in class, that it's being practiced very differently in various places around the world. One of the things that I think is shocking for students when they read Ibn Battuta is the way in which he interacts and treats women. So he describes the various places that he goes to, getting married to various women, having children with various women, and that was very much part of the Islamic social and cultural tradition. Now, where does that come from? Well, here's a passage from the Quran. The believing men and the believing women are allies of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and establish prayer and give charity and obey Allah and His Messenger. So if you read that passage, that suggests men and women are spiritually equal. However, here's another passage from the Quran. Men are in charge of women because of what Allah has given one over the other. Righteous women are devoutly obedient. The Quran and the Hadith support a highly patriarchal society. We see this with the legality of polygamy, where Islamic men could have multiple wives, but not vice versa. So what caused the Islamic Caliphate or empire to collapse? So when we think about the collapse of empires, right, we usually like to break it down into both our internal and external factors. When it comes to the internal factors, we have that internal struggle, that sectarian strife between the Sunni and Shia, which is going to continue and break out into various civil wars across the Islamic world. We're also going to have external forces coming in. We'll talk later about the Crusades, these attempts by Christians to retake portions of the Holy Land from Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, these nomadic people who swept in from Central Asia, and then ultimately the final external force that leads to the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate were the Mongols. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these three big questions. What caused Islam to split shortly after Muhammad's death? How did Muslims unify and consolidate their empire? And then what caused the Islamic Caliphates to fall? Thanks for watching. Family. And at one point, Muhammad had given a speech where he had referenced that his cousin Ali was a possible candidate for succession, and therefore some viewed him as the rightful successor. So there is this split, and the sect of Muslims that wanted Abu Bakr to become the leader believed that Abu Bakr collapsed. what caused Islam to split shortly after Muhammad's death. In the last video, we described how Muhammad was able to unify the various warring Bedouin tribes or clans on the Arabian Peninsula, but ultimately upon his death there was an issue of succession about who should succeed Muhammad as both the political and spiritual leader of this. Welcome back. We are going to continue our exploration of Islam, and in this video focus more on the growing Muslim community. Some Muslims wanted Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's close friend. He was also an experienced military leader, and therefore, in many people's eyes, he was the person who was most qualified for this title, while others wanted and believed that the title of leader needed to stay within the bloodlines on the political or state building side. So we'll focus more on Islam as an expanding empire. So the big questions we need to be able to answer are: first, what caused Islam to split shortly after Muhammad's death? Second, how did Muslims unify and consolidate their empire? And then third, what caused the Islamic Caliphates of the Islamic Empire to eventually collapse?